Okay, this is the Finance Committee meeting, February 23rd. It's 7:11 Cleveland time. So let's start with, we're going to be discussing 12, 15, and 16. So let's start with 16, which is an ordinance amending section 107.15 entitled Financial Disclosure Statements Required of Chapter 107 of the Administrative Code of the Codified Ordinances of the City of North Olmsted entitled Code of Ethics in order to amend the local filing deadline to match state law and declaring an emergency. I believe this was the council president's motion, correct?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quite simply, we had in our ordinance a different date than what the state of Ohio requires elected officials to turn in their financial disclosure documents. And it just seemed to make sense to me to update our code to reflect what the state is requiring so that none of our elected officials are caught off guard perhaps by having two different dates. It's the same forms. It's not like our city is requiring different forms than what the state of Ohio requires. So that's very simply why I just thought council would like to take a look at that and possibly change that.
Sorry about that. Okay, any questions from committee? Mr. Broussard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Really just a quick comment. Good catch by the council president. I fully support it. Makes perfect sense to me. And thanks for bringing it forward.
Any questions from council? Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, this is not with regard to this legislation. My question is directed to Law Director Garreau. Mr. Garreau, are we allowed to attend meetings from remote locations? Just asking. I have had to be absent because I was in North Carolina taking care of grandchildren, etc. I appreciate that we all want our personal time, but I don't think our charter voted to permit that. Am I correct or incorrect, sir?
Mr. Chairman, if I may. Currently, anyone can remote in from a remote location at this point. We don't have any requirement that somebody be physically present within the city of North Olmsted, and it's a virtual presence. But I understand that the council president has legislation she'll be bringing forward to discuss the parameters of future online meetings, and it may be a topic you wish to discuss. But the only requirement we have is that if you're going to have a in-person meeting, everybody has to be in person. You can't have, six of you sitting in the council chamber and one of you at a distant location. You can't do that. But if you're all scattered around the four corners of North Olmsted or Ohio or the United States or the world, there's certainly nothing to restrict you from being able to remote in to be in the meeting.
Thank you. It's nice to know that. I was being too moral. Thank you.
Mr. Limpert?
Yeah, just to comment back on the legislation. I had asked that when I had first come on council as well, trying to understand because it was confusing on when the deadline was, and I'd been told that in the past that was set up just to, I think, make sure that everything was prepared correctly, etc. In the 6 years, I haven't experienced any issue with we're always well informed of when this is due through numerous channels, and appreciate the council president bringing this up. It just makes sense to keep consistent with the state guidelines on this. So thanks.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we recommend 2021-16 to all of council, and I'll ask for a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great, thank you. It appears to me that all of council is in attendance. I hope that's correct. Along with the mayor, the council president, Director Lieber, Kopfer, Garreau, Gallo, and guests, just for the record. Okay, next we're going to discuss let's go to get the other easy one out of the way. Let's go to 2021-12, which is an ordinance to amend section 13106 entitled Authority to Accept Donations of Chapter 131 of the Administrative Code of the Codified Ordinance of the City of North Olmsted entitled Mayor, in order to allow the mayor to accept any cash or gift card donation to the Division of Youth and Family Services or the Division of Aging. I believe the council president offered some amendments. The law director, council law director has sent some potential amendments. I'm not sure where you guys are at with that. Council President, you want to take that? You want to?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, the law director did incorporate the amendments that I had suggested for the committee to look at and see if those were acceptable to you. I'm open, of course, to changes as well. And if you wanted me to go through each one, I'm prepared to do that. Or if you just had specific questions about specific ones that you wanted to address tonight.
I had a chance to look them over. I don't have a problem with any of them. Perhaps maybe members of the committee might be interested. I don't know. Mr. Broussard, Mr. Kelly, you guys have any questions? Have you seen them?
I've seen them, no questions. Thank you.
Same, I've seen them, everything's fine, thanks.
Anybody on council have any issues? No? Okay, I think we're good then. So I will go ahead and make a motion that we recommend 2021-12 as amended. Do we have to make a motion to amend it right now? Is that the proper? Would that be appropriate? Okay, we'll go ahead and I'll recommend that we amend 2021-12 as presented by Council President Jones and also the law director, and ask for a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So 3-0 to amend it, and then I'll go ahead and make a motion that we recommend 2021-12 to all of council. Ask for a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, 3-0 for that. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead and discuss 15, which is an ordinance to, 2021-15, an ordinance to make appropriations for current expenses and other expenditures for the city of North Olmsted for the year ending December 31st, 2021, and declaring an emergency. Director Kopfer, you want to start? I know you sent some stuff out. Your mic's off.
Out of curiosity, could you see me a minute ago?
I can see
Because
you.
I was sending an email and I've always wondered if like you see this, the screen goes away or if the camera stays on. Anyway,
I don't know. Did I mention you that you were here?
yes, you did.
Okay, then I saw you.
I'm sorry that I ended up with as many exhibits as I did, but I was trying to trace the numbers because at the last meeting we had difficulty discussing numbers and where they were coming from, and so I tried to compile all the information. So that's why there's a lot of exhibits attached and related to this memo. So I don't know that we have to go over it all if you don't want to. If it was acceptable, the answers, or whatever your preference is, Council.
Well, let's try this. Let's open it up to questions from committee and see what we get, and then open it up to questions from council. So, committee, any questions for the director?
I don't have any at the moment, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Mr. Kelly? No? Any questions from council? Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with items I think are in the memo or are touched on in the director's memo. So on the question of the revenue in the general fund going from 3 million to at year's end to 4.2 million, I read the explanation. I guess the question is if that was a conservative view of trying to guess based off of where 2019 was, you know, in the memo you showed us in November that we had 4.7 million and December 4.2 million. At what point did you realize it was not going to be $3 million, Mr. Director?
I realized that in the last 2 months of the year because, and really probably in October as well, once the COVID monies came out or the expenditures came out and were applied to the COVID fund, and the revenues were coming up. But even in December, oftentimes the reader revenue in December is horrendous and can tip us dramatically the other way. So I wasn't going to increase that amount until we knew what that amount was going to be, because it can flip-flop in a matter of a month, and Decembers are very low collection periods, especially considering the revenues that were, or the collection period that was pushed back into into later in the year. So I was not going to change it. So I felt comfortable with 3 million, and if we end up with more, great. I don't see a problem with it.
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess what I'm trying to ascertain is whether that extra $1.2 million should have been relevant to our budgeting process, which we didn't pass until December 22nd. We had a lot of meetings before then. You know, we entered this process of the budgeting. I understand that the hospitalization and the debt items were not in, but we entered with a mindset, and council was held to the standard of a balanced budget in terms of our amendments. We're, you know, dollar in, dollar out, right? If we have an extra $1 million in the general fund, that's relevant to that policy. So that's that's my concern on that question. I have other questions, but Mr. Chairman, if you'd like the director to respond first, that's fine by me.
That'd probably be best, Director.
Yes, I understand where you're coming from, but when you're worried that $859, which I understand is the projected unencumbered balance at the end of 2021 with the preliminary estimates, was $859, $1 million still isn't going to get you to where you should want us to be, which is having a carryover and not having to budget that carryover, which, even though the unencumbered balance is completely part of the current year estimated resources, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to worry about that at all and kept a fund balance in there for reserves in the general fund? So I don't feel that it's a problem, and I didn't see, you didn't make any, you know, gee, I wish we could do this, 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 and this with, if I only had $1 million. Council wasn't in disagreement that we should watch what we're doing and spending because of also 2021, we didn't know what was coming on. Remember, in the late fall, we were also hitting spikes and peaks again in COVID. So I'm perfectly comfortable. I'm perfectly comfortable where it was. I thought it would probably end up at like around the 2019 at 3.4, but it ended up more. And if you look, it's still, the revenue ended up 1.9 over, and the expenditures ended up dramatically under. So I think we minded our conservative budget, and I don't see any problem with it. This money spends just as easily next year, or God forbid, even 2 years down the road. So I think it's perfectly fine. And I'm sorry, revenue 1.2 and expenses were down 2.9. That's the 4.1 in general fund monies.
Mr. Chair, if I may finish on this topic, and then I have a whole slew of questions, but I'll yield to others after this for the moment. There's a line
Okay,
between, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a line between conservative budgeting, which I think all of us appreciate, and making the decision for council by withholding information. And that may not have been the director's intent.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Mr. Chair.
Please go ahead.
Withholding information
Director.
is a little uncomfortable, considering I send out monthly reports as soon as they're done. So I don't really think that we're withholding information. They go out every month.
What I'm trying to say, Mr. Chairman, is that by not revising the revenues, council didn't have the opportunity, which it's council's responsibility. It is not the finance director or anybody else's responsibility for appropriations. It's council's responsibility to make that decision. So without having a full picture, and when that information is known, when holding back may seem like a good conservative principle, not telling us does not allow us to do our job. And that is the problem that I have, Mr. Chair, on that topic itself. But I'll yield for the moment to others who wish to ask about other questions.
Mr. Limpert?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, two things. One is I think Ms. Kopfer makes it very clear every year that she's being conservative in her budgeting, and that we're aware that we're more likely to get a surplus than have to cut things. So, I feel like that's pretty transparent when we go into the budget processing. I do think that the point is less about how we came to the number, but the fact that we do have a different budget number now, and that those discussions on the permanent budget versus temporary budget are valid conversations of, is the new appropriations what we want to spend it on, or is there other places that should happen? So I appreciate the conversation in regards to how we came up with the number, but it seems pretty transparent on how our budgeting process works every year. And just in general, I think it's good that when we do have a surplus or the number does come up bigger than expected, that we have good dialogue here for a permanent budget that encompasses the full information. I think that's why I've been pleased these last few years that we've done a temporary budget so early in the cycle to give us enough time to have this permanent budget conversation. So thank you, Ms. Kopfer, for keeping us informed on how this has evolved and taking a consistent approach every year. And Mr. Glassburn, I think these are all prudent questions in regards to what do we want to budget the permanent budget for. So thanks.
I happen to agree with Mr. Limpert on this. It's been my experience over the last 10 years that we have had very conservative preliminary budgets, and we got a lot closer at the actual budget. And I think that that's something that I've come to expect. So, Ms. Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I I'd like to just add a comment that, you know, our original temporary budget was dated November 24th. Those were the printout dates. And that since we had so many discussions and meetings with regard to amendments, and we were working really, really hard, all of us, to try to figure out where to scrape together money for, you know, certain programs and, you know, and trying each of us for whatever things we thought were important to the city. I think that it would have been much more prudent to have given an updated revenue in that process. There was plenty of time for that. So while I appreciate, you know, the director's ability to want to be conservative, I think that when we're in the process of the temporary budget and we're working with amendments and we're trying real hard to find money, I think that balance in that period of time for us to work with would have been exceptionally helpful, because we would have known that we would have had more money. So that's all. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I have to let my dog out while I'm walking, so if you get dizzy, don't watch. But I wanted to
Go ahead,
add,
Director.
yes, that as you recall, that I did say all along that this budget was a complete quandary for me because of what was going on in 2020 and the additional concerns that we were having in the end of the year. Like, we didn't see any end in sight. We did, and then we didn't. And so for me, this was a horrible budget year as far as trying to manage it, and it was very nerve-wracking. So it wasn't my best budget performance. However, as you can tell, in the prior years, I was fairly close and accurate. So, you know, can we accept that there was a global pandemic that might have impacted our budget even at the local level? That maybe, you know, it's harder to estimate in 2020 for 2021? That's all I'm asking.
Maybe we could discuss the points of the budget that are of interest to council members. Mr. Glassburn, you got something?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So to the moving forward part, to what Councilman Limpert addressed, is our goal to maintain a dollar in, dollar out policy in terms of our decision making, because the proposal, while it has additional revenue that's been realized, also has additional spending and does not have offsets for much of that spending. So that is a relevant point as to, is that our goal still, or is it not our goal? If it is, then we should develop relevant offsets or weigh individual projects against each other as to which ones are the higher priority to fund. If that's no longer the goal, then I think it's a different type of discussion, Mr. Chair, and that's where I'm driving to in terms of this look back and forward global before we get into the nitty gritty. So, Mr. Chair, if you want to respond to that, or anyone else, I'm happy to hear, and then afterwards my questions will pertain to specific items.
Director, you have anything you want to say?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought he was discussing that with council, that it was what's council's goal in this. So that's what my assumption was.
All right, let's go ahead and discuss specifics here. What do you got, Mr. Glassburn? I'm sure you've got some things in your mind.
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for funding the program that was passed by council, the small business relief, and for this new program proposed by the mayor, the total for the council, the relief program is 51, and I count 25 towards the new program, so that's 76. I see the 30,000, 34,000, I'm sorry, 30,000 from the combined of the fireworks reduction and the 5 from the consulting. And we have the 16 that matches perfectly on the extra COVID money. But that's still short 29,000 as to funding 4,000 presumably for the relief program and the 25 for the new program from the mayor. Is there an intention to have an offset? What is the offset if so?
Director?
It was proposed to utilize unencumbered fund balance from the Economic Development Fund, along with all the changes that you recommend that you already stated. So there's a $34,000 from the general fund, and then there's a $5,000 reduction in the consulting contract, and $16,996 in the COVID relief fund. And the remaining is an increase in expenditures in the Economic Development Fund.
Okay, so if we want to offset that to make it balanced, we need to find 29,000 in programs or things to cut. Is that correct?
Is that council's policy? I mean, we discussed it I believe we were discussing in the general fund that we needed to make it budget neutral when we were doing the initial budget projections, but this one does increase the general fund expenditures by $204,800, of which the $34,000 is the transfer to economic development, and $64,300 is for the Clegg Park project. So take out, say, $99,000 or $100,000, so $104,000 increase to the general fund expenditures.
Mr. Chair, I have additional questions, but again, I'll yield if anybody wishes to jump in at any time. On another topic, there's $30,000 for the insurance. I forget the correct term, reevaluation. This is something we've discussed before. This just was not in the budget, or why is that entering into the process at this point?
Mr. Chair, that was one of the items that was the last that the administration took out of the budget to balance the budget. We've put it off a couple years for various reasons, but we really feel that this is an important project so that we're properly valued for our insurance. Not that we don't give a list of increases in capital assets to our insurer, but it's always better to have an appraisal done every so many years.
So is the assumption that this would save in excess of 30,000 or save money at this point?
No,
I
it's
think
risk management.
I think it's pretty obvious we've been wanting to do this. It's to protect ourselves, to protect the city. And perhaps Director Gallo could speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The director is correct. We have attempted to budget for it the past several years, and it has been put off. Our insurance, our liability insurance broker has encouraged us to do this for a while now. So we would like to go ahead with council's blessing to budget for this and start the process. This involves somebody coming out, taking an inventory and looking at all of our buildings. There have been updates that have been done over the past several years. So we would like to get the process moving forward since we've delayed it for several years now. Thank you.
Director Garreau, you had your hand up.
I did, and Director Gallo kind of touched on it. It's simply an appraisal to ensure that we have our assets are sufficiently valued and that it matches with our coverage. If we have every year, your building values change. We did multi-million-dollar improvements at the wastewater treatment plant, and we need to make sure that if there's a catastrophic loss, we valued that asset, and we have a commensurate amount of coverage to ensure that if there's a catastrophic loss, a fire, that we have sufficient coverage to ensure that we don't have to go out of pocket or borrow. And I think Director Gallo knows that over at Parma Heights when they had a fire not too many years ago, when somebody committed arson at City Hall. I think in Parma Heights, you got to make sure you have your property valued correctly. And I think this was the point of the appraisal, was to ensure that we have our buildings and assets are sufficiently valued and that our coverage is sufficient to deal with that. It's something we should certainly do every couple of years. I've dealt with it personally, and it's cost me money because we didn't have sufficient coverage. So it's a good investment for taxpayers' dollars.
We've certainly had put a lot of money into the fire station in the last few years, and of course this last year we put a lot of money into City Hall too, and certainly changes values. Mr. Glass, go ahead, Director.
I just wanted to add that it's for like replacement cost purposes. Like, we know what we expended on it, and we send that information. The insurance companies know what we paid for our assets, but this is to make sure that they are valued properly for replacement cost in the event that something happens and we have to rebuild or do something like that.
Mr. Glassburn, you got more questions?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Heeman has had her hand up, though. I'll yield to her if that's your.
That's fine, Ms.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair. So just out of curiosity, so in the years that we do not get appraisals, I do know that insurance companies will increase your value by a standard across the board, 2%, 5%, whatever they deem appropriate. Can you tell me what that percentage has been in the past? Like, what has the increment been that they've taken us up because we've not had an appraisal? Is my first question, and then I do have one other. If someone could tell me.
Director Gallo.
Mr. Chairman, Councilwoman Heeman, I do not have that information in front of me, but I'll get it to you.
Okay, because it's somewhere between 2 and 5 is what, the natural increase is that they put us to. And so if the expectation is that our building valuations are going to increase, I would expect significantly, then are you budgeting, Director, for our increase in insurance costs? What is your projected budget for that?
I can get that information to you. We do budget, we add that into our budget every year if there's any increase or anything like that.
Well, what I'm saying is, because we've not had these appraisals, right? We've only gone up incrementally by 2% or 3.5% or 5%, whatever the carrier deemed to increase. And I know that they do every year. And so that if we're now going to jump 12% in value of our buildings, for example, wastewater treatment, fire station, City Hall, then naturally our coverage will have to increase, and it will cost more per however many hundreds of thousands, right? So I want to make sure that we have considered the cost of that projected increase in insurance in our budget now as it stands, or we don't have that in there now, Director Kopfer.
Director?
Director Gallo determines the insurance budget, but I do believe it's fairly consistent to the prior year, which that's a valid point, that once we do a reappraise, that in October our rates will go up. I would assume.
Makes sense. Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The original question I was trying to drive at was there an offset, or did it in and of itself, this reevaluation, this reappraisal, add value that offsets the cost, or add savings, I should say, that adds to the cost? But it sounds like that's not what this is to do.
Director Gallo, you want to comment on?
Just a point. Sometimes if improvements are made, that can also affect the insurance, where it can go down in one area and go up in another. So that's the point of the appraisals is if we've done any improvements on any of our buildings, it would be a benefit to us as well in some instances. So is it possible that once everything is appraised, it can go up? Yes, but it could also not. So that's a point of getting someone to come out and take a look at everything to see where we are. It hasn't been done in a while, and if we can get it done this year, that adjustment would probably be worked into next year's budget, if there's any sort of adjustment. Thank you.
You're, Director Gallo, you're speaking about, say, putting a roof on a building, you've got less chance of having water damage and that kind of thing, or you're talking about ADA access, less chance of getting sued? That's what you're referring to?
It's things like that that can play into the appraisal process.
I understand. Thank you. Councilman Limpert.
Yeah, so to Mr. Glassburn's point, I mean, provide savings. It would provide savings if we have a damage to the buildings and we, based on assessing these assets, we have a higher value of insurance coverage on that, right? And that's theoretically where savings would come in, but not from just an annual budgetary standpoint. If anything, it's going to cost us more to pay for the higher asset value insurance, right?
Mr. Chair, I very well recognize that this may be a very useful thing for us to do. I'm trying to ascertain how we pay for it. And, you know, more often than not in budgeting, it's not that there's something that's clearly bad and something that's clearly good, and you're just going to pick the thing that's clearly good. It's picking from a bunch of good items and deciding which ones you can afford and which ones are the higher priorities. So this very well may be, but in this new permanent budget, it doesn't appear there's an offset. It doesn't appear that in and of itself, we should assume there's any decrease in expenses related to it. So if we want to keep this, we should look at finding $30,000 to pay for it if we are going to try to hold ourselves to balanced changes to the budget.
Mr. Limpert?
Well, and perhaps a little bit more, right? If our insurance coverage is going to go up based on the assessment, or does that not kick in until next year's budget?
Director?
Mr. Chairman, by the time we get someone to come out and do the appraisals this year, it probably would not affect this year's budget. It more than likely would be next year's.
Okay. Thank you.
But the 30,000 is an estimate that would be in, we're asking for that to be in this year's.
Okay. So when you say that 30,000 is an estimate, I mean, have you looked into this? Have you priced it up at all? Or is that just a guess, or what are you doing here?
No, we go by the information our broker gives us, and that is the estimate that they gave us to find someone to come out to do the appraisal.
And they know what we got, so, okay. Director Coffer, do you want to respond to Mr. Glassburn's question about where the money's coming from?
Well, the administration in the permanent appropriations that they proposed show an increase in the general fund budget. If you look at the total of every fund, you'll see if it's gone up, then it's utilizing fund balance. In exhibit, hold on one moment. In exhibit 6, we presented the side-by-side budget and then popped out where the variances are. So you can tell if there are increases, and you go to the total in the fund, you'll see that it increases a certain dollar amount rather than yeah, 204,800 on page 3 of that document. So that's how much we're proposing to utilize of fund balance for the general fund. Hence the new unencumbered balance at projection at the end of the year of 900 and, I don't have it right in front of me, 926,144. So if you're asking the administration how we did it, that's how we did it. So on every item, there's not an offset for every item. We looked and we valued the things that were the things that we had really wanted to accomplish but couldn't. So there are some additions, and we moved some projects around. And so if you see an increase, it's utilizing fund balance. If you see a plus and a minus, then and the total for the fund is 0 variance, then it utilized the fund balance from somewhere else, or the account from somewhere else, and it's budget neutral.
Okay, thank you, Director. Director Gallo, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
No, unless anyone else from council has any questions.
Okay, Ms. Eman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just if a piece of information could be followed up with later. So, Director Gallo, perhaps you can find out for us when we invoke this appraisal, right? So let's say, you do it in June, and then the appraisal comes back and now we have to increase the insurance. Can you find out from our broker, because unfortunately I don't recall, how long do we have from the time we are notified of the the new value of our business to then increase our insurance and do all of those things? Does the appraisal go stale at 30 days, 45, 90? What is that, so that we know, okay, do we really need to have this in the budget right now as the permanent, because maybe we don't, since you're stating to us that the appraisals won't actually be done until later in the year, and the premium payments for any increases wouldn't come until next year's budget. Perhaps this is an item that is, I'll call it fluid for lack of a better word, right? It doesn't have to be, stable in this budget, but looking out more toward the end of the year and we get our rebalance perhaps, and then add it in, is I guess what I'm wondering. If I could know what the longevity of the appraisal is, what the lifespan is. Thank you.
Yes,
Director.
not a problem. Yes, no problem.
Mr. Glassburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do want to point out, before I go further, that we still have, again, unless I am not interpreting this correctly, around $2 million or more of using reserve balances for various special accounts that are covering obligations that may or may not be things that have historically or should be general fund items in different times. So it's great we have 926,000 in the general fund. We don't want that to be 859, but by still taking down separation pay, street maintenance, EMS, hospitalization, workers' comp by hundreds of thousands of dollars each, we are effectively paying for these items indirectly with those balances. So it's not just a found money situation. Unfortunately, we are still using reserves across a variety of special funds that are bolstering the general fund, much in the way the CARES Act money did. So with that context, there were a number of items on the director's list that were corrections: the uniform allowance, the contractual services for law, the increase in cost for the mini excavator. Those items are around 52,000. Again, it appears there's not an offset. It appears those are things that we must do. So that's, again, something I would look to, that we have to figure a way to pay for it if those are things we must do. My next question though is, so we have a $200,000 engineering escrow. Director, can you tell us what the 200,000 is going to? Again, if I apologize if I missed it in the previous presentation.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Director.
Yes, sorry, Mr. Chair. The engineering and the trust and agency fund is just deposits that we receive for projects that are in process, or for, tap-in deposits, all sorts of things, whatever we take deposits on. And then when their job is complete, we have to reimburse that to the contractor. So we're holding it. It's a requirement to hold it in a separate fund. And it's a requirement to hold it in a separate fund, and then we will be able to, we have to pay it out of that fund. So it's an in and an out. And at the end of the year, I look at what accounts we have, like what open items we have. So then I budget what we need to do. And if I'm not mistaken, that was completely, it wasn't even budgeted. So it was an error. So it's a technical correction. We always pay hundreds of thousands of dollars out, and we take hundreds of thousands of dollars in.
So, Director, I understand you don't necessarily subscribe to my view of budgeting, but is it accurate to say then that this is not something that, if you did subscribe to my view of budgeting, that would need to be offset because it's not a true expenditure, it's a reserve?
It's not even a reserve. It's a deposit that we're holding. So it's a requirement. We're holding it in trust, and we then reimburse them and send the money, give the money back to them. So it's not using a fund balance. It's using a fund balance that was made from deposits that contractors paid into our account for these projects that they're doing, and then we have to budget expenditures out to pay them back. So it's not something that needs an offset because it already does have an offset. It has a deposit that went in, but paid by a contractor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next topic I had was the tax collection fees. There's two $42,500 amounts that add up to 85 from two special accounts. Are these there because they're offsetting something else, or we just didn't include them, or Director, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Those were items, again, that were corrections that I realized when I was going over the final for the permanent appropriations that we did not budget for the income tax collections fees to be paid out of the permanent improvement street and storm and solid waste and recycling fund. These are normal recurring expenses out of that fund every year. It was an oversight to not budget for them. So this is a normal recurring expense. It always comes out of that fund. And it's not like we're taking it from the general fund, so the general fund doesn't have to pay it. These are proper expenditures out of the fund that happen every year on a regular basis.
Thank you, Director. I recognize these are regular expenditures and each fund pays its portion, but if we didn't include it before, it does still reduce those individual funds by a collective 85,000, which is just something to note.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Glassman, if we may move, before you move on to the next, is
Yes.
that these items, like the money that's in that fund is utilized for a specific purpose. And those revenues that go into there are revenues that are budgeted to go in that fund, the 15% of the income tax collection and the 15% for each of those funds. And they have to carry the burden of the 15% of the expenses. So yeah, it's taking out the fund, but it would have, if I had it in the temporary budget, like I should have, it would have already been taken out. It's not something that, oh my, we're taking something and we're giving up doing a project out of. We're not, because we have to pay the income tax expenses out of there. So it's a legitimate expense. It was just an oversight in the temporary.
Mr. Chair, I recognize again, these are important expenditures, and these are, in this case, an annual expenditure. What I'm saying, though, is that we are considering other expenditures out of those funds. And so this means that those funds have 42.5 each less than we previously thought. And so that may factor in our decision making as to whether we want to take even more money out of those funds into a bigger deficit for the year. So on an additional topic, I think I know the answer already, but in adding the street sweeper back and pulling the salt truck, that nets an increase of 70,000 of spending in the streets. There's not an offset to that. Is that a correct understanding?
Director?
If you're comparing it to the council passed budget, the final council passed temporary budget, then yes, that's it was like 270,000 versus 270 or 200,000, I believe.
Okay. Mr. Chair, that's the balance of my questions on specific budget items. I have some questions on the specific proposal of the new program that the mayor has proposed for economic development, but I'm happy to wait on that topic until we finish with budget items if others have questions.
Go ahead, Director. You want to respond to that, or what?
I guess just before we move away from Mr. Glassburn's comments and concerns, I applaud everyone's efforts to try and be budget neutral, but some of these funds, like we've built fund balances in these funds to be able to have financial flexibility in difficult times to then adjust for those. And then in better times, we're making sure we're funding them at what they need to be. I would never recommend, for example, if I thought that the separation pay fund was going to be utilizing all its expenses with the retirements and we couldn't fund it, I wouldn't have recommended that. But those are accruals and estimates that you keep putting into that fund during good times, and so that you have those monies there when you do hit a year where 5 or 6 people retire and you still only put in a few $100,000 and you're expending 6, but that's the nature of an accrual and an estimate. So there are ebbs and flows in these funds. And the healthcare fund, yes, we reduced the amount that we were contributing, but the fund was still sufficient and in being able to maintain and pay all our claims and our administrative fees and to have a sizable carryover balance. So, and the street maintenance fund and the permanent improvement fund, all those funds we build in good times, and it's okay to use some of those fund balances when we need to get things done. And if this is remember that this is the mayor's budget, and he felt that the 270 for a street sweeper was important enough to put in the budget, in the temporary and the permanent, and to spend that and prioritized it over the expense of a salt truck. However, he felt it important because there's value in utilizing that equipment for the programs that he wants to. Sometimes it's not just a dollar and cents thing. Can you believe an accountant said that?
Mr. Chair, if I can respond.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So but here's where the, no pun intended, the rubber meets the road. So we have, we're spending down the balance in street maintenance, for example, by $500,000. A year ago, we needed a salt truck. Now it's not as much of a priority in light of other things. But if we say we add that salt truck and now we're reducing that balance to 700,000, that's the position of the administration is, no, don't do that. We don't have money for it, right? So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, why is 500 okay, but not 600 or not 700, or where these lines are to achieve it. We're doing the same, we're reducing EMS and hotel motel by a few $100,000 each. We don't have enough money for a third police car, even though our police cars are getting up to 100,000 miles. Okay, fine, we have tight resources, but that's where the line is as to how deep we're ready to go for these things. It's hard to say, okay, no, we don't have money for the salt truck, but now we can add these additional items. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I see others have their hands up.
Ms. Heeman?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know what, I have read through all of the material that we got about the street sweeper. I'm convinced it's broken. Let's buy one, okay? But we weren't told it was broken, so we didn't really know, right? So there we are, having this conversation over something that we don't even necessarily know the fact about. That's irrelevant at the moment. We're going to get a street sweeper. But on insurance and things like that, our broker really does require that we have these appraisals done every 3 to 5 years, and they in fact can drop our insurance if we don't. And I don't know why, it's now that, oh, we haven't done this, and there's a scramble. I've asked for a rebalance when we were doing the amendments in the original temporary budget. I did not get one. I'm suggesting, Mr. Chair, at this time that since we have enough time before the budget must be passed by, date certain in March, at the end of March, I'm suggesting that, we get a full rebalance of the budget. We get a new printout, just the way we did when we went through our first budget. We set a 4-hour Saturday meeting or some other time and start from the beginning again, because every time I get information, it's at 5:30 for a 7 o'clock meeting. It's difficult to go through. Then we have additional questions, and I think let's just start over. I'd like to just see us sit down with a brand new, proposed budget, however she wants to present it to us, the director would like it presented, and I think start over, because this is all getting very convoluted, and every time I ask for a rebalance, I want to look at new paperwork, a new report, right? I can't get one. So I'm having to try to piece together emails, this, that, a scrap of paper, exhibits that can't print out because the blue is too dark on my printer, right? I can't read some of the stuff. I'd like to really do a real budget. I'd like to really do a careful budget, because our budget is tight this year. So I would like to see that happen, but it's not my committee. But thank you, Mr. Chair, for indulging me.
Director?
You received I'm not sure what you call a rebalance. However, I do believe I'm interpreting it to mean the expenditure detail report that ties to the permanent appropriations, which you received when the permanent appropriations was introduced. So you do have that information as well. So I don't know. And honestly, I was trying to simplify the process to show where the changes were. I mean, you already know the things that you went through in October, November, or whenever we did it, that you had questions about, that you weren't sure or whatever. You already have those. Go through the new stuff, and if you want to make changes, you can make changes to it. But
I shouldn't be doing your work, Director.
You're not doing my work. I'm doing my work. I've already done my work.
Council President, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just touching again on the street sweeper. I know that I had asked at the last budget meeting what the average life expectancy of a street sweeper was. And I was just wondering if the administration had come up with that answer yet, because I don't believe that it had been sent to me.
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Go ahead.
It's about 15 to 20 years. I think this one lasted over 20. The one we currently have.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I guess I'll just say as far as that goes, and I believe I mentioned at the last budget meeting that I'm certainly in favor of the purchasing of a street sweeper, seeing as how the one that we have is completely broken down. And I know that our fleet department is amazing in all that they do to take care of all of our vehicles in the city. I guess, again, kind of following on the questions that some of the other council members have had, though, it's concerning to me that this piece of equipment that has really outlasted any type of life expectancy that it should have, was not on last year's budget, was not brought to council's attention that this piece of machinery that we absolutely need to maintain our streets and roads, the conditions so that we are keeping our storm sewers clear, that it wasn't in last year's budget. It was never brought up to us. And that's a concern of mine, and I know some other council members, again, just following on the backs of their questions. I don't know. I guess I don't see the point of holding on to a piece of equipment until it becomes completely unserviceable before we go out to find a replacement. And that was my comment on the street sweeper. Thank you.
If I could answer that, Mr. Chairman, I completely agree with you. And when I took over the safety service position and met with the foreman, we changed a lot of things. A lot of things changed because I started talking to all the workers. I started talking to all the foremen, and that's where those changes came in when I took the reins and took charge. Thank you.
Sorry. Mr. Limpert?
Yeah, just a comment. So I think when we went through the budgeting process, what I'd like to see going forward is some of the directors do a really good job of showing, and the finance director in the past, I think, has shown certain things that she's cut from the budget when we go and do our temp budget, of saying these were the things that we cut. Finance director also, obviously, we have a capital plan, and I think just getting more overview of the capital plan on, prior to the temporary budget, I think would help all of us better understand, the status of different equipment when we go into that temporary budget review. And that's kind of what I'm hearing from some other council members. I know the fire chief does a good job of saying, hey, I wanted this, but we pulled this when he goes through his budget. So those are just some things I think that some of the council members some of the other council members are mentioning, and that I would agree with, is just getting better view of the capital plan going into the budget will help us understand what's really next, so to speak. So when we do have a larger budget figure, we kind of know what's coming into that budget. But that's all my comment. Thanks for humoring me, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? All right. I don't suppose it'd be inappropriate to hold this in committee, and then we can reconvene before the council meeting on the 1st, 2nd. Is it the 1st? 2nd, probably. If Mr. Glassburn, you got anything you want to say?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I believe it's the 2nd that you're describing, but that aside, I did want to hit on one aspect of the one of the proposed items, which was the mayor's program for mini grants. I guess my concern is, we went through a process for both funding and passing legislation for the relief grants. We passed that on February 2nd. We budgeted it last year. The application went live on the city website on Monday. However, 2 weeks earlier, we have a survey and announcement of the program, for the mayor's program, that hasn't been either appropriated for or passed in legislation. And so while I have questions about the program, my larger question is this the only item that is proceeding without authorization and without funding? Or are there other items or other priorities that are in this budget that are going ahead regardless of what council's process is or the budget process?
I'm not sure who you're directing that to.
Mr. Chair, anyone on the administration who wishes to respond, but I think it's a concern that all of council should share, that if programs are being executed without authorization, without funding, while we're debating them, that's not how this process works.
Ms. Lieber, you want to respond to that?
Sure, unless the mayor wants to say, I saw his hand up too, but I'm happy to take it unless.
Good, you could start if I have to follow up.
The part of the program that we're proceeding with is the technical assistance in partnership with CSU, where all funds relative to that program will be coming from CSU. So the only funds from the city, well, there's no funds from the city, it's just staff support, circulating the survey, collecting input so that we can be poised to co-host these sessions with CSU. So whether or not funding is put in the budget, we can certainly proceed with this partnership regardless of a budget allocation. And we still think there's value in this portion of the program, regardless if the mini grants are funded by council. So it's not something that we think needs legislation. This is an economic development activity that the department can carry out with its partner in CSU. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we go ahead, Council President.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly following up on Councilman Glassburn's question about things that are being listed in the budget. Could you please explain why there are employees in the wastewater treatment plant that are getting annual increases and merit increases? My understanding from our conversations during the temporary budget discussion was that that would not be happening this year.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I could. It's important to note that those guys down in wastewater treatment plant are extremely valuable. Any one of them could go to regional sewer district or Rocky River sewer, and particularly regional, and make more money. So I try to stay as on top of that as possible and make sure that if someone is a little bit under scale, and I think there was 2 people there that we gave merit raise to, Carrie, if I'm correct on this, and then a few other people that had licensures that the union got, so we gave them their license raise, right? Is that correct? And by the way, we've lost some people down at the wastewater treatment plant because of that. I can't afford to lose anyone else. It will not benefit the residents to lose anyone else down there.
Director Copper,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. The mayor had asked, yeah, there were a couple people that did receive after looking into merit raises, and several were the relationship of the increase in licensing for union members, and then the equivalent to those who hold licenses in the administration. So they gave them a little bump for that.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Could you let me know, please, Director, where in the budget these increases are?
They're in the existing salary budget. There was no increase in the salary budget for those.
So, okay, so it's not shown in the permanent budget, which is why I couldn't find it in the document that we have.
It's not an increase in the line item. So yes, there's no increase in the line item.
So how are we budgeting then for an increase for these salaries?
There's been attrition there, and so while they're rehiring people, their line item should be fine.
And just one more quick question, Mr. Chairman. Then who verifies the licensing? Like who's who checks on that and then approves a merit or increase based on that?
That's not in my department.
That would be me.
Okay. So then my understanding is there were increases that went through. It's just not being, the salary line item is not changed within our budget that we see.
Mr. Chair, nor will it increase in the budget that is passed. It's within the line because of attrition there. They have money in that line item for the next year that they can cover those. So it was within the line item, and it was also within the range in the pay ordinance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Heeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that, Council President's questions and those of Mr. Glassburn are the reason, Mr. Chair, that I'm asking for an entirely new, budget meeting, that we get a new presentation, we get to understand what the salary increases are going to be, not be. We were told there weren't any. Now we're just asking to just look, don't care whose they are because, the total doesn't change. I really think that we deserve, sir, a whole new budget meeting from scratch with presentations from each department that is going to present changes to us. So perhaps maybe not the police department or the fire chief, because maybe they're fine with what they presented previously and that's all that they want. But it sounds certain to me that other areas have changed dramatically, and we are now having to drill them down one at a time, and it's very time consuming and frustrating. So if you would consider it, I would be grateful. Thank you.
I'm perfectly comfortable with Director Kopfer's answer on that. I know for a fact that we had a couple people leave last year, and it makes sense that we have to be competitive to hold on to the people that we have down there. So the mayor's answer, I'm comfortable with that also.
Mr. Chair,
Ms. Williamson, you had your hand up.
Not valuable employees, please. I'm not disputing that.
You know what?
And retention is important. Thank you.
I really wish you wouldn't talk over me. Ms. Williamson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I think Mr. Glassburn had his hand up before me.
He did. We hadn't had your hand up the whole time, and I wanted to leave that. Okay.
Thank you. I'll let him.
Do you want to go ahead? Okay, Mr. Glassburn, go ahead.
Okay, so Mr. Schuman, I understand the discussion of retention. There's a couple of larger issues here. One is, are we all trying to achieve pay freezes, or are we not? There's a morale question with all of the rest of the employees who are sacrificing. I'm sure there were police officers or firefighters or recreation center employees who would have merited on their performance increases. To isolated pick one department and do this is a major morale issue. It's an equity issue. And again, it gets to the question of, is this accurate information we're being presented? Because this is tonight the first time I've heard about this issue. So I want to know what other individuals, whether they're unionized or not, are getting merit increases when we have the overwhelming majority of our employees taking zeros. And on top of that, we furloughed people this past year. We aren't taking donations at our Oxcart pantry because we don't have the staff to handle it, because we don't have volunteers. We don't have the manpower to do the things.
I really appreciate it, Mr. Glassburn, but you're doing like this soapbox thing, and I'm really getting kind of sick of it. Ms. Williamson, you got something pertinent you want to bring up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. But Mr. Glassburn could not have said it any better than I could have. And I have to wholeheartedly agree with everything that he was just saying. It's not right. I would love to give raises across the board, but based on all of the financials that we were presented last year, we furloughed, we cut, and now, we have one department being singled out. And yes, it's a morale buster. I would like to know any other departments, any other employees, whether they're union, non-union, whether it's by attrition or not, if any other employee has gotten a raise, merit, anything across the board throughout the city, any other department. And I think that that's a fair request to make based on what's just been announced tonight. So thank you.
Ms. Copper, you got a comment?
Yes, I do believe that, I believe Council President Jones already asked for that information, but excluded the union contracts, the union employees. So she already has a list of those that received those any increase, and we also excluded those who because the minimum wage went up. So minimum wage also caused a lot of people to get increases because their minimum wage went up as well. But I can add the union employees, because if that's what you want, we can do that.
Mr. Chair.
Dave, perhaps you could share that with all of us. Ms. Council President.
Yes, I would be happy to have the clerk make sure that council receives the document that I had requested. And I don't know actually I don't know if you have access to that document right now, Mr. Massarolo, but we'll make sure that council sees that. Thank you.
Ms. Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Council President, does that document have any kind of explanation as to what the increases were for? Or is it just a document with increases?
A document with increases.
But there's no explanation?
No, but I mean, if I don't know, if our Mr. Chair, I'm sorry for requesting, but if our clerk has access to the document, perhaps he could share with the council.
I guess what I'm requesting though is that if we did get a document with all of the employees who were provided merits or any kind of
justification
and pay, what it's for, rather than just providing us with the numbers. I'd like to know what it's for, whether it's minimum wage increase or attrition or however we're going to explain it. But if we could get that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Understood. Okay. Well, hopefully we can get those answers. And I would suggest, as I did at the last meeting, that any questions that you have for the director, or the administration be put in an email. Give us all a chance to see it and see the answers. So, Ms. Heeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you please set a deadline for the director's response? Unfortunately, 5:30 before 7 o'clock meeting is not completely helpful. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I mean, earlier deadline.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Council was also told to send all their questions and concerns to myself and the chairman before the end of last week, and no one did. And yet you're asking all these questions this evening. So let's treat people the way you want to be treated.
Okay. Let's say if you have some questions, you want to get it to the director by, I don't know, Friday morning, okay? And then we can talk about it on the 2nd. Thank you.
But, Mr. Chair, my question involved not only when our deadline of presenting questions was, but what is the deadline going to be for the director to give us the information? I think that's just as important because we needed in enough time to digest it and maybe ask follow-up questions to her instead of doing this like she's suggesting we're, you know, inappropriately asking questions right now.
You're not inappropriately asking questions, Council. Forgive me, you took that way. Mr. Schuman?
Go ahead.
If you want answers back by the end of the weekend, then you will need to get questions to me by the end of tomorrow so that I have time to gather the information and request it. I think we ran a report out of our payroll system for the changes in who got raises and who didn't. I don't recall, I don't have it in front of me if it said merit or annual or something, if it had some verbiage on it. Otherwise, we'll have to go through every person and go back to their payroll change notice and determine what was checked off for that increase. So that may take some time if that's the way, if we don't have it listed in the system.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and make a motion that we hold the budget that's 2021-15 in committee and ask for a second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right, we'll plan on having a meeting before the council meeting on the 2nd. Thank you.